Good. Thanks so much. I'm excited to be back presenting and seeing everyone again. I am working on my PhD at the University of Florida in Extension Education, and I have worked in Extension internationally and in the U.S. Since before grad school. But this is actually from my thesis research in Peru, and this data was collected in 2020, I would say right as the world was turning upside down, and we barely got it collected and made it back in March. So I'm excited to share this, and it looks at collective actions, and that term, what I mean by that is peer-to-peer activities. So farmers working with other farmers through association, a cooperative, or pooling their labor, their marketing, different activities like that. So as we go on, you'll understand more what I'm talking about here. And I do want to recognize Dr. Diaz, Dr. Warner, Willis, Ochieng as the co-authors on this project. So framing this study more broadly, we see a lot of investment in smallholder farmers and their marketing. And that's because smallholder farmers are an extremely important group. The majority of farms worldwide are smallholder farmers. They produce a lot of the food in the world. In developing nations, the majority in a lot of cases. But what we see is, ironically, this group goes to bed hungry often. Food insecurity is a major issue, economic issues, and we see a lot of poverty among smallholder farmers. What research tells us is that a lot of those constraints and those issues are linked to the production constraints and issues that smallholder farmers face. So when you look at the productivity, you see things like accessing input and output markets, that can be a major issue for smallholder farmers, being able to afford inputs, being able to access finance, and a lot of that has to do with the risk that smallholder farmers face. It's not always worth the effort or the money to try to access a new opportunity or a market, or for a company or a financial services provider, they see too big of a risk in offering those services to those farmers. So resultingly, this is a major issue that we see a lot of continued food insecurity and poverty, and we're going to look at that in a more applied situation. So zooming into my context for this study, I looked in Peru. And Peru, the majority of coffee producers are smallholder farmers. Their land is less than 3 hectares, the majority is 7.4 acres, depending on the unit that you're looking at. Smallholder coffee farmers, in addition to what I just talked about, face additional risks because they're involved in an international market. So when you see the price of coffee on the world market fluctuate, smallholder farmers, coffee farmers are at the mercy of that. So there's additional issues in competing with the international trade, and with an international commodity can be difficult for small farmers. And that's where research tells us that association, collective actions, when smallholder farmers can come together, they can better navigate those issues. They can better compete in those markets. And that's because those risks are reduced. That's because when smallholder farmers come together, it's easier to look at transportation to a market or to get inputs. It's easier to buy a larger amount of fertilizer or a larger amount of product because they're doing that together. And that quantity issue, just like we buy, if we buy a larger amount of something, it's cheaper, they can overcome that in a lot of cases. And what we see in Peru and elsewhere is that when smallholder farmers work together, they also receive higher prices. Commodity markets, coffee markets often require a large amount of produce, a large amount of coffee. If the farmers aren't able to meet that amount, they will sell to small intermediaries and small traders locally, and they have less control over the prices. When they're able to meet the quantity amounts for these larger markets, they can get higher prices, access things like fair trade markets, other markets, and doing that together. Collective action is a way that you can build your own capacity for the farmers to do that. And even direct-to-consumer markets is another opportunity that farmers working together have achieved. And I will point out quickly that these are photos that we have permission to share. I love including photos from our research of the farmers that I worked with, but I think it is important to recognize that they gave permission and I said I would be sharing these. And looking at our problem statement. So we see a lot of benefits to collective actions, but we see that smallholder farmers often don't work together. So there's some research that's looking about why that is. Why are some farmers pursuing collective actions working together and some are not? Some of that tells us that trust and social cohesion are issues or barriers to that working together. But there's a lack of documentation or research looking at that from an intrinsic perspective. So even trust is measured indirectly in a lot of cases and not really looking at how do you feel, what do you think from the farmer's perspectives. So looking at how important collective actions can be for smallholder farmers, we wanted to look at this gap in how we look at collective actions from the intrinsic perspective and better understand the factors inhibiting or encouraging smallholder farmers from pursuing them. So the purpose, kind of what I said, is to address that gap, looking at the relationship between perceptions and engagement in collective actions for production and commercialization activities, and to look at smallholder farmers' attitudes, aspirations, and knowledge and skills. So you may recognize that theoretical framework, which I'll show here in a second, regarding working together with their peers and their motivation. What would motivate them to pursue collective actions? So the conceptual framework is adapted from Bennett's hierarchy of needs, where you have knowledge, attitudes, skills, and aspirations. So looking at attitudes and aspirations, we wanted to look at what are perceptions around working with peers, around working with other farmers. Perceptions around autonomy, working independently on your own, or just more generally external support. What do you think about the need for external support, outside assistance in your production? And then to follow that model, we also look at self-reported knowledge and skills related to peer mobilization. We look at one behavior, which is pooling production, that's related to this, and the other is extension, because I'm always interested in extension. That was included as well. So 40 smallholder farmers were interviewed in the central highlands of Peru. I traveled there in 2020. This wouldn't have been possible. We used purposive and snowball sampling, which wouldn't have been possible without our partners. So we worked with the UPC, Universidad Peruana de Ciencias Aplicadas, and SharedX in Peru. So SharedX is an impact farming company. UPC is a university there. So they were amazing to help us link up with these communities and to train and provide enumerators in the field to help me collect this data and to be more culturally sensitive and to understand these communities where we were working. So the variables were Likert type variables. They were extracted from my broader thesis data set and for their relevance in collective actions. We also looked at surveying farmers' demographics, their formal education level, and engagement with extension and technical support. Analysis was fairly straightforward using descriptive and central tendency measures, and then Spearman's correlation coefficients were used for the correlations that I'll talk about. And again, I think pictures can speak louder than words. This was the group and us working in Peru. The 3 students that worked with us and got a certification from UF to add to their credentials and help us. And then Ivan and I, he was from SharedX, the company that's a social enterprise type impact farming coffee company. So we can move forward. So just some key findings that I want to highlight here. So when we looked at perceived power to negotiate prices, and I'm just going to go through the findings and then we'll talk about what they mean with conclusions. But perceived power to negotiate prices had a positive association with knowledge and skills to mobilize. So to mobilize peers, that was positively associated. There was a negative association with reported ability to commercialize using your own resources. And a negative association with not needing external support to develop the agricultural business. This was a stronger inverse correlation, which was when farmers said, I do not need external support to develop my agricultural business, that was inversely associated with working together with other farmers will help me earn more. I know it's kind of hard to put that in your mind when you have something framed negative and then we have inverse. So you could also look at that as if a farmer says, I do need external support to develop my agricultural business, they also believe that working together with other farmers will help them earn more. So I think that's an easier way to look at that one. So the last perceptions finding here is when farmers believe they can earn more money than most other local producers doing their coffee production, that was positively associated with aspiring to work to grow trust with other farmers, because trust is critical as a precondition, and we'll talk about that more. It was also positively linked with or associated with knowledge and skills to mobilize, and had an inverse relationship with perceived ability to increase your productivity using your own resources. And finally, with the findings, when we looked at behaviors, the extension one's fairly straightforward, but I will say the frequency of pooling resources, pooling your production. So putting your coffee together to access markets together had a negative association with perceived ability to commercialize using your own resources. So let's talk about what that means in a more concise way. So farmers perceive important benefits from improving their knowledge and skills in peer mobilization. We see that research suggests that when farmers have the capacity to work together, when they know how to organize and access these markets together, major benefits can come from that, including accessing better prices and having more leverage over those markets. So farmers across the board, some of those associations were telling us that farmers perceive a need for assistance. They need outside assistance in their production and marketing. So what's interesting here though, and I wish I would have asked this, could that assistance come from the group working together? So instead of outside external support, which we often see isn't sustainable, especially when NGOs come for a temporary amount of time, we see cooperatives as being more sustainable, to pool labor, to access inputs together. Could we see that external support coming from that grassroots community level? And finally, the third conclusion, coffee farmers that report being confident and knowledgeable in their skills around mobilization, that they are also motivated to build trust with other farmers. So they want to build trust, which is a precondition to mobilization. And that has implications for how you would identify leader farmers or farmers that could lead these collective actions. And the other thing I'll point out about that is coffee for a lot of these farmers is kind of one of their occupations. So they may also have a store that the wife or the husband or together that they're running. They likely, in what I saw, have other crops and things. So what we saw is that some farmers, though, talk about coffee like, oh yeah, it's just something that I do. And then other farmers said, there are big opportunities for me in coffee production. And that seemed to make a difference in how they wanted to produce that confidence, those knowledge and skills, which I think is important. So finally, recommendations would be building on those conclusions to concentrate your capacity building on smallholder farmers' knowledge and skills in their peer mobilization, and look at how to illustrate these benefits. This can be a lighter touch approach. What we've seen where I've worked in other places is farmer-to-farmer exchanges can be really effective, where farmers from one community travel to another community that is similar in certain ways to their community, and they look at that as an inspiration, or they talk to those farmers. And we see farmers learn better from other farmers. My next presentation will talk about that more, but that's an important thing to look at. Not only capacity building, but also trying to motivate by illustrating those benefits. Like I said, local community-based capacity, looking at that as a way for development rather than always nonprofit outside support, unless that also builds that. So that's important. And then we know from diffusion of innovations and behavior change that targeting the more innovative farmers to lead these collective actions will be good for setting trends and to diffuse these to the broader community and other farmers. So with that, thank you, and I think we have some time for questions.
We have 5 minutes for questions, so I'll open it up to the audience for questions, and if there are none, I have a question.
You mentioned an advantage is you increase yields for farmers. What about quality?
That's a really good question. So the main thing with quality is the trade-off between labor and quality. So when you're harvesting coffee, you can do multiple passes. So this coffee is harvested by hand. If you go through one time, you're going to be picking some green berries, some red berries, or yellow, depending on the type of coffee, or some that are overripe. But that's going to save you a lot of labor. The collective action, and where that could come in, is that you have that, and I saw this in Brazil where I also worked, farmers making labor parties and working together and scheduling days, and it's a little more organized. And with the multiple harvests, like 3 times when they're ripe at those different times, you can have a higher quality bean. But if you're not selling to the larger markets, often those intermediaries are looking to buy from lower quality farmers in smaller quantities that you just bring to the community. So it'd be better if you're accessing a more specialty market or a bigger market for that.
Do you notice any differences between different communities, or was it kind of similar across the board?
We did notice some differences. One of the communities was more diversified. I mean, they were fairly similar, but one community, I think they were really reducing their risk through diversification of their activities. One of the farmer's wives, she was running a shop, and he was saying that when we're not receiving money for the coffee, this is our source of income. So that was really important. And I think that changes what coffee means to them. And I'm not here to say you should be going gun-ho for coffee, because I think that diversification can be really important. So I think that was the main difference that I saw.
I was wondering I may have missed it, but did you see any evidence of when farmers were quote-unquote collective action? I'm wondering about collectively mobilizing for working towards labeling or working within larger eco-sensitive supply chains so they can actually have a fair price at that more market level. So I was wondering if that was involved in your research at all.
So with SharedX, the company, there's the logo there, they're impact farming, so their investors want to see that they're making a social difference. They have to put out impact reporting and everything. But the communities we worked with, we didn't want the bias of them already working with SharedX. That wouldn't make sense for us to survey those communities. But SharedX is a potential outlet for them to access some of those markets. I didn't see in this area of Peru so much of the Fair Trade Rainforest Alliance. I know I'm not presenting on that research, but in Brazil I looked at certified markets some years ago. And the main conclusion there was that when multiple NGOs and different types of service providers come together, they help them access those markets. But it can be pretty hard, just the farmers coming together, to start to access some of those bigger names that we know.
In order to keep on time, maybe one more question, and then you can always visit with Colby after the presentation. So one more.
Okay. So thank you so much, Colby, for that wonderful presentation. During your presentation, actually, trust resonated. I wonder, because you're talking about collaboration among smallholder farmers, and I know that in developing countries, trust is an issue. So what did you find in terms of trust during your research?
Yeah, so those findings showed that when farmers saw more potential in coffee, that they were more confident about producing coffee and growing that business, they wanted to build trust with their counterparts or their peers. So we didn't really see trust more generally not related to their production, how that was there. But I think that needs to be looked into further. I think I showed that main significant correlation there. But I think we tend to think of trust as being easier to achieve than it actually is. And a lot of farmers throughout the world have an independent mindset. And I think demonstrating based on like the economic motivation and actually seeing those examples through that farmer to farmer exchange in different ways can be important to build trust.